My son cried out in horror as my daughter-in-law Carly stood still with her arms still extended after throwing the glass of wine in my face. "You worthless old hag! When I ask you for more wine, you obey!" she screamed, stumbling drunk in my dining room. At that moment, something inside me snapped, not in anger or pain, but in clarity. As a retired judge, I knew the law very well, and I knew exactly how to use it to show her who was really calling the shots in this house. The dinner had started off quietly. It was just another Friday night meal I usually prepared since my son Andy and Carly moved into my house 6 months ago. The story was always the same. They were saving up to buy their own place. They just needed some time. 6 months later, they were still here with no sign of leaving anytime soon. I had spent the afternoon preparing a prime rib roast that took hours in the oven. The table was set with my best china, the plates with the delicate blue rim that my mother had given me when I was appointed to the bench 30 years ago. The crystal glasses I had inherited from my grandmother shimmered under the light of the chandelier. For me, these small formalities mattered. After 3 decades as a criminal judge, routine and order were what kept me anchored in retirement. The house had been quiet before they arrived. I had grown accustomed to the silence after my husband passed away 5 years ago. There was a dignity in that solitude, a peace that came from everything being exactly where I had placed it. Now, with Andy and Carly here, that order was constantly disrupted. Shoes left in hallways, dishes in the sink, loud music at odd hours. But I tolerated it because Andy was my only child and I wanted to help him, even if that meant housing Carly too. Carly arrived already agitated that evening. She walked in the front door at 7:30 p.m., tossed her purse onto the sofa, not hung on the coat rack where it belonged, and went straight to the bar in the corner of the living room. She poured herself a heavy amount of red wine while complaining about work. "That idiot of a boss thinks he can keep pushing me," she said as she emptied the glass in 3 big gulps and filled another before even sitting down at the table. "He made me redo the entire report because, according to him, critical details were missing, as if he could even recognize a critical detail if it bit him in his fat ass." Andy shot me an apologetic look as he helped carry the plates to the table. My son had always been like that, trying to please everyone, avoiding confrontations at any cost. Even as a child, he would rather give away his toys than argue with the other children who tried to take them. Now, at 34, this same tendency had evolved into something more concerning. I had begun to notice how he would check Carly's expression before speaking, how he would adjust his opinions to match hers. The confidence he once had as a successful veterinarian seemed to be slowly draining away. "Dinner looks wonderful, Mom," he said, the sincerity in his voice a small comfort. Andy always appreciated the effort I made, even when Carly didn't. During dinner, I tried to maintain a civilized conversation, asking about Andy's job at the veterinary clinic, commenting on the new book I was reading, anything to dilute the growing tension Carly carried with her. But every time we spoke, Carly interrupted with some cynical comment or rolled her eyes like a moody teenager, and not a 32-year-old woman with a master's degree in marketing. And with every interruption, she drank more wine. In the courtroom, I had learned that silence is not absence. Silence is a choice. Silence is strength dressed in satin. So I chose my words carefully and observed. The way Carly's hands shook slightly when she wasn't drinking. How her eyes darted to Andy whenever he spoke to me with affection. The way her entire body tensed when I mentioned my sister's estate, which I had been helping to settle for the past year. These were the same micro-expressions I had learned to read in defendants who were hiding something. "So, Judge Eleanor," Carly said, emphasizing my former title with a subtle mockery that never quite crossed into open disrespect, "tell us about your exciting day of reading and gardening. It must be so fulfilling to have such a peaceful retirement." The implication was clear that my life was now insignificant, my achievements in the past. "Actually," I replied evenly, cutting a perfect slice of the roast, "I had lunch with Justice Mercer from the Supreme Court. We're working on a mentorship program for women in law." I didn't need to add that Ruth Mercer had been one of my law school classmates or that we had remained close friends throughout our careers. Let Carly make what she would of that. The flash of uncertainty in her eyes was brief, but satisfying. It was the same look I had seen in courtrooms when someone realized they had underestimated me, but it quickly hardened back into the dismissive gaze I had grown accustomed to. By the 3rd bottle of wine, I decided that enough was enough. When Carly held out the empty glass in my direction, as if I were a waitress waiting to serve her, I simply said, "I think you've had enough for today, Carly." She froze, the glass still raised in the air, her eyes fixed on me as if she couldn't believe what she had heard. The silence that followed was like the pause before a verdict is read heavy with anticipation. "What?" The word came out flat and dangerous. "I said you've had enough. This is my house, and I will not allow you to get drunk this way at my table." My voice remained calm, measured. The same tone I had used to sentence men who had committed heinous crimes. It was like lighting a fuse. Her face turned red, not just from the wine, but from a sudden fury that seemed to have been there bubbling under the surface for months. "Your house?" She laughed, a bitter sound that cut the air. "Just because we have to live in this old museum with you doesn't mean you can treat us like children." Andy touched her arm. "Carly, please." His voice was soft, pleading. The voice of someone who had learned that appeasement was the safest strategy. Carly pulled her hand away. "No, Andy. I'm tired of this. Your mother looks at us as if we were intruders, as if we weren't worthy to walk on her precious hardwood floors." She turned to me. "Do you know what your problem is? You can't accept that you're no longer the powerful Judge Eleanor Miller. Now you're just a lonely, retired old woman who needs to control everything and everyone around her to feel important." I remained calm. Years in the courtroom had taught me not to show a reaction when provoked. It was a skill that had served me well when facing the most aggressive attorneys and the most defiant criminals. It would serve me well now. "If that's how you feel, maybe it's time for you to find somewhere else to live." The words were not delivered with anger, but with the same clear authority I had used to issue court orders. "Mom!" Andy exclaimed, horrified. He looked torn between his wife and his mother, a position I never wanted to put him in, but one that seemed unavoidable now. Carly smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. The smile I had seen on the faces of those who believed they were above the law, who thought their actions would never have consequences. "Servants shouldn't talk like that to their superiors." She held out the glass again. "Now more wine?" "No." That was all I needed to say. 2 letters that carried the weight of decades of authority. In a movement too fast for me to react, Carly threw the glass directly at my face. The crystal hit my right temple and shattered. I felt the sharp pain of the impact, then the warm heat of the blood running down the side of my face. My son screamed. Carly stood there breathing heavily, almost surprised by her own action, but showing no remorse. I brought my hand to my temple and looked at my fingers now stained red. The silence in the room was deafening. 30 years sending criminals to prison, and now I was bleeding at my own dining room table. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so painful. "Andy," I said with a calm that I did not feel, "take your wife to her room now." Andy rushed to pull Carly, who still seemed stunned by what she had done. I heard their steps going up the stairs, the room door slamming shut. Then muffled voices, one pleading, one defensive. I went to the bathroom and examined the cut in the mirror. It wasn't deep, but it would bleed a lot, as head wounds often do. As I cleaned the wound with cold water, my thoughts organized themselves like a prosecutor preparing a case. This wasn't just about a glass thrown in anger. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been escalating for months. The disrespect, the drinking, the subtle ways she manipulated my son. I documented everything with my cell phone. I photographed the cut, the bloodstain on my white blouse, the shards of glass on the dining room floor. I collected every fragment and put it in a plastic bag. Evidence. 30 years in the justice system taught me that evidence is everything. Words can be denied, stories can be twisted, but physical evidence tells a truth that cannot be easily dismissed. That night I couldn't sleep. Sitting in my office with an ice pack against my temple, I began to outline my plan. Not for revenge. Revenge is emotional, impulsive. What I needed was justice. I needed to protect my son and my house. At 6 minutes past midnight, with the wound already forming a purplish-blue bruise, I picked up the phone. "Miami Police Department. How can I help you? I want to report a case of assault." The officer arrived at 7:30 a.m. As the morning sun began to enter through the curtain cracks, Carly and Andy were still sleeping, exhausted after the explosion of the night before. I had been awake for hours, dressed in a navy silk dress that complemented my silver hair. Pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother, light makeup that partially concealed the bruise, but left it visible enough to serve as evidence. I had made fresh coffee and set out cups in the living room, a judge preparing her chambers for an important hearing. I opened the door, and the police officer, a middle-aged man with gray hair at his temples, introduced himself. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm Officer Davis. I received a call about an assault." I invited him in and took him to the dining room where the pieces of glass were still preserved in a corner marked with small numbered labels that I had prepared during my sleepless hours. My years on the bench had taught me the importance of methodical preparation. It was here where it happened, I explained, keeping my voice low so as not to wake the two upstairs. My daughter-in-law threw this glass at my face when I refused to serve her more wine. She had already had too much to drink. I showed him the photos on my cell phone, the cut on my temple, the blood on the blouse that I had preserved in a plastic bag unwashed. The officer wrote everything down with a professional, non-judgmental expression. He had probably seen this scenario hundreds of times, family tensions exploding into violence. But usually it wasn't a retired judge who was the victim, someone who knew exactly how to document and present a case. "Is the aggressor still in the residence?" he asked, glancing toward the stairs. "Yes, sleeping upstairs with my son." "Do you wish to file a formal complaint?" I hesitated only for a second, thinking of Andy, but then I remembered Carly's look as she threw the glass. That certainty that she could assault me in my own house and get away with it. "Yes, officer, I do." As if on cue, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Andy appeared first, his face drawn with worry and lack of sleep. Then Carly, her expression transforming as soon as she saw the police officer. The belligerence of the night before was gone, replaced by a mask of confused concern. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice soft and bewildered. "Why is there a police officer here?" She moved closer to Andy, taking his hand, playing the role of the devoted, concerned wife. Officer Davis stood notebook in hand. "Mrs. Miller, I'm here regarding an incident that occurred last night. Your mother-in-law has reported that you assaulted her by throwing a glass at her face." Carly's expression was a masterclass in manufactured shock. "What, that's absurd. Mom fell last night after having too much wine herself. Andy and I tried to help her. Tell him, Andy." She turned to my son, her eyes conveying a message that didn't need words. "Stand by me. Defend me." Andy looked from Carly to me, then to the police officer. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the trained response to support his wife warring with the truth he had witnessed. I don't... Andy," Carly's voice was gentle but insistent. "Tell the officer what really happened. How your mother had been drinking too, how she lost her balance and fell against the table." I said nothing. This was Andy's moment to choose, and I would not pressure him. I had faith in my son and the moral compass that I had tried to instill in him throughout his life. Even if he faltered now, I knew that the seed of truth would eventually take root. Andy swallowed hard, his eyes meeting mine briefly before he spoke. "Officer, my wife is lying. She threw the glass at my mother when she refused to serve her more wine. I saw it happen." The transformation in Carly's face was instant. The mask of concerned wife cracked, revealing the rage beneath. "You fucking traitor," she hissed, dropping his hand as if it burned her. "After everything I've done for you." Officer Davis stepped between them. "Mrs. Miller, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to the station for questioning regarding this assault." "This is ridiculous." Carly's voice rose, the careful facade completely gone now. "She's manipulating you, can't you see? She's a judge, of course she knows how to work the system." She turned to me, pointing an accusing finger. "You've always hated me. You've been trying to drive a wedge between Andy and me from the beginning. Well, it won't work. Andy knows who really loves him." But Andy had stepped back, the confidence in his decision growing stronger as Carly's mask fell away. "Go with the officer, Carly. We'll sort this out." His voice was firmer than I had heard it in months. "You need to pack some essentials, Mrs. Miller," Officer Davis said. "We'll be placing you under arrest for assault." "I'm not going anywhere. This is my house, too." Carly's voice had risen to a shout, her body tense as if ready to fight or flee. "Actually," I interjected calmly, "it is not. The deed is solely in my name. You are here as a guest, and given the circumstances, you are no longer welcome." The words were delivered without emotion, a simple statement of legal fact. Officer Davis nodded. "If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to place you in handcuffs." For a moment, I thought Carly might physically resist, but something in Officer Davis's steady gaze must have convinced her of the futility. With a final venomous glare at both Andy and me, she stomped upstairs to collect her things, the officer following closely behind. When they were out of earshot, Andy turned to me, his face crumpling. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have stopped her. I should have done something earlier." I moved to him, then taking his hands in mine. You did the right thing just now, Andy. That's what matters. I didn't add that I had seen the signs for months, the way Carly isolated him from his friends, how he had stopped visiting his favorite jazz club, how he checked his phone constantly, as if afraid of missing a message from her. Those were conversations for another day. Officer Davis returned with Carly, who had a small overnight bag and a face set in stony defiance. "We'll need you both to come to the station later today to give formal statements," he said to Andy and me. As he led Carly to the police car, I stood in the doorway watching, not with satisfaction or triumph, but with the same solemn resolve I had felt when passing sentences in court. Justice wasn't about winning, it was about restoring balance, and this was just the first step. After they left, Andy seemed lost, standing in the middle of the living room as if unsure what to do next. "Should we have breakfast?" he asked, his voice small like a child seeking direction after a storm. "Yes," I said, leading him to the kitchen. "And then we have work to do." I didn't tell him yet about the phone calls I planned to make, the inquiries that would begin today, because my judicial instincts told me that the wine glass was just the visible part of a much larger problem, and I intended to uncover it all. What I didn't reveal to Andy yet was the other reason I had been meeting with Justice Mercer yesterday. It wasn't just about the mentorship program. Ruth had mentioned something in passing that had caught my attention, a case involving financial fraud where the perpetrator had used a similar pattern to what I was beginning to suspect with Carly. A pattern of infiltrating families with assets, isolating vulnerable members, and then systematically draining resources. While I prepared scrambled eggs and toast, I watched Andy sitting at the kitchen island, staring at his hands. I had raised him to believe in honesty and integrity, but somewhere along the way, he had also learned to doubt himself, to seek approval at the expense of his own well-being. I needed to help him find his strength again, but first we needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with. "Andy," I said as I placed a plate in front of him, "I need to ask you something important. Has Carly ever pressured you about money, about our family's finances?" He looked up, surprise flickering across his face, followed by a guarded expression that confirmed my suspicions before he even spoke. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I need to know what we're facing," I replied simply. "This isn't just about a glass thrown in anger. I think there's more." Andy's shoulders slumped. "She's been interested in your finances, especially since Aunt Margaret died. She keeps asking if you've mentioned an inheritance, if I'm in your will, things like that." He looked ashamed. "I didn't think much of it at first. Money's been tight for us, and I thought she was just worried about our future." What Andy didn't know, what I had kept private from everyone except my financial advisor, was that Margaret had indeed left me a substantial sum, $12 million in property and investments. She had been a shrewd businesswoman, more successful than anyone in our family had realized until her estate was settled. But I had kept this information quiet, continuing to live modestly on my judicial pension. Old habits die hard, and my parents had raised us to be discreet about finances. Now I was grateful for that discretion. "I see, Pam," I said, not revealing what I knew. "Has she had access to your accounts? Your savings?" Another flicker of discomfort crossed his face. "We have a joint account for household expenses, but my main savings are separate." He hesitated. "At least they should be. I haven't checked the balance in a while. That would be our first order of business after the police station. But I didn't want to overwhelm him now. He needed time to process what had already happened. "We'll figure this out together, Andy. One step at a time." I reached across the island and squeezed his hand. "You're not alone in this." The look he gave me was a mixture of gratitude and lingering shame. I should have seen it coming. The way she changed after we moved in here. The drinking, the mood swings, the constant criticism. He shook his head. "What kind of veterinarian am I if I can't even recognize predatory behavior in my own home, despite everything that made me smile slightly? Human predators are considerably more complex than the animal variety. They've evolved to be very convincing." After breakfast, as we prepared to go to the police station, I made a quick call to an old colleague, Benjamin Reeves, a private investigator who had worked on many of my cases before retirement. He answered on the second ring, his gruff voice instantly familiar. "Judge Miller, to what do I owe the pleasure?" He was one of the few who still used my title, a small courtesy I appreciated more than I would admit. "I need your services, Ben." Discreetly. "It's a personal matter." I kept my voice low, though Andy was upstairs changing. "I'm listening. No questions, no hesitation." This was why I valued Ben, his professionalism and his understanding that some matters required immediate attention. I need background on my daughter-in-law, Carly Miller née Carlson. 32 years old, works at Meridian Marketing. I'm particularly interested in her financial history, previous relationships, any legal issues that might not be on public record. I paused. And I need it quickly. Consider it done. I'll have preliminary findings to you by tomorrow. He didn't ask why I didn't need to. In our long professional relationship, he had learned that I never requested information without good reason. Thank you, Ben. The usual rate plus a urgency premium. I ended the call just as Andy came downstairs. At the police station, the process was methodical. We gave our statements separately, mine precise and detailed as befitted my legal background. I described the events leading up to the assault, Carly's increasing intoxication. The exact words exchanged the trajectory of the glass as it hit my temple. Facts without embellishment. The detective assigned to the case, a sharp-eyed woman named Martinez, took additional photographs of my injury and asked follow-up questions about any previous incidents. Has your daughter-in-law displayed violent tendencies before last night? I considered my answer carefully. Not physical violence, no, but there has been a pattern of escalating aggression in her speech and behavior, particularly when she drinks, which has been increasingly frequent. Detective Martinez nodded, making notes. And has she ever threatened you or your son? Not explicitly, I replied. But there's been an undercurrent of intimidation, particularly directed at my son. I didn't elaborate further, not wanting to speak for Andy's experiences. After the statements were recorded, Detective Martinez explained the next steps. A temporary restraining order would be issued preventing Carly from returning to my home. She would likely be released on bail within 24 hours, but would be required to stay at least 500 feet away from both Andy and me until the hearing. Given the circumstances and the clear physical evidence, we're charging her with simple assault for now, she explained. But depending on what the medical examination shows and any additional evidence, this could be upgraded to aggravated assault, which carries more severe penalties. I nodded, familiar with the gradations of charges. And when is the hearing scheduled? Preliminary hearing will be next Friday, Judge Hoffman's court. She gave me a knowing look. I believe you've appeared before him in your previous capacity. Indeed I had. Harold Hoffman was a fair judge, if somewhat by the book. He would follow the evidence where it led, which was all I could ask for. As we left the police station, Andy seemed simultaneously relieved and overwhelmed. What happens now? He asked as we walked to the car. Now we protect ourselves, I replied. First, we need to check your financial accounts. Then we change the locks at home. And I've already engaged someone to look into Carly's background more thoroughly. Andy stopped walking. You think there's more to this than just last night? I turned to face him, choosing my words carefully. Andy, in 30 years on the bench, I learned to recognize patterns. What happened last night wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of months of escalating behavior. And in my experience, people who become violent over small provocations usually have other issues that haven't yet come to light. He absorbed this, then nodded slowly. I trust your judgment, Mom. I always have. There was something different in his voice, a resonance of the confident young man he had been before Carly entered his life. It gave me hope. At the bank, our fears were confirmed. While Andy's main savings account was intact, the joint household account had been systematically drained over the past 3 months. Small withdrawals at first, then increasingly larger sums, with the most recent $5,000 withdrawn just 2 days ago. I don't understand, Andy said, staring at the statement. Our household expenses aren't anywhere near this amount, and I've been transferring my share regularly. The confusion in his voice was giving way to anger, not the volatile rage Carly had displayed, but a slow-burning indignation that I recognized as the precursor to moral clarity. We'll file a fraud report, I told him. Add it to the police report. This establishes a pattern of behavior. By the time we returned home, it was late afternoon. A locksmith had already arrived, arranged through another of my former courthouse contacts. As he worked on the front door, Andy and I walked through the house, identifying anything that belonged to Carly that would need to be packed and removed. The process was necessary, but painful for Andy, I could tell. Each item a framed photo from their wedding, her collection of scarves draped over the bedroom chair, the expensive face creams lined up in the bathroom, represented another piece of the life he had thought he was building. I feel so stupid, he said as we stood in the bedroom they had shared. How did I not see who she really was? It's not about intelligence, Andy. It's about trust. You trusted her because that's who you are, someone who believes in the goodness of others. That's not a flaw. It's one of your greatest strengths. I sat on the edge of the bed, patting the space beside me. When he joined me, I continued. The people who prey on that trust, they're the ones with the flaws, not you. He seemed to consider this, though I wasn't sure he fully believed it yet. Healing would take time. What will happen to her? He asked finally. That depends on many factors, I replied honestly. The severity of charges, her prior record if she has one, how she behaves through the legal process. But for now, focus on yourself, on healing. The locksmith called up that he was finished. New keys, new security. A small but significant step toward reclaiming our home as a safe space. That evening, after a simple dinner of soup and bread, neither of us had much appetite. Andy retreated to his old bedroom, the one he had used growing up. I sat in my study organizing the day's documentation and preparing for what would come next. The file on my desk was already growing police report bank statements, photographs, my own meticulous notes. I was reviewing these materials when my phone rang. It was Benjamin. Judge, he said without preamble. You're going to want to see this right away. I've found some concerning information about your daughter-in-law. Already, I was surprised by the speed even for someone as efficient as Ben. Let's just say she left quite a trail for someone who knows where to look. I'm sending you an encrypted file now. Password is the name of that case we worked on in 007, the one with the identical twins. I knew immediately which case he meant. Thank you, Ben. I'll review it tonight. After hanging up, I opened my laptop and waited for the file to arrive. When it did, I entered the password. Mendoza, the name of a complex fraud case involving twins who had created an elaborate scheme to steal from elderly victims. The file opened to reveal a comprehensive dossier on Carly Carlson Miller, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Carly wasn't just a woman with anger issues and a drinking problem. She was something far more calculated. The report showed 3 previous marriages, each to men with significant assets, each ending in divorce within 2 years, with Carly walking away with substantial settlements. There were police reports that had never led to charges, domestic disturbances, allegations of property damage. One protective order that had been filed but later dropped. Most disturbing was the pattern Ben had identified. Each relationship had begun shortly after the man in question had experienced some financial windfall or inheritance. Each time, Carly had positioned herself as supportive, understanding the perfect partner during a time of transition. And each time, once legally tied to their assets, the supportive facade had crumbled. As I read further, one detail jumped out at me, a search history from Carly's laptop that Ben had somehow obtained showing queries about Judge Eleanor Miller inheritance and Margaret Miller estate value, dating back to 6 months before she and Andy had moved in, before they had even mentioned financial difficulties to me. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned. Carly had targeted Andy specifically because of his connection to me, because of what she thought he stood to inherit. I closed the file, my judicial mind already categorizing this new information, fitting it into the larger case we were building. But beneath that professional assessment, I felt a deep maternal anger. This woman had used my son, had preyed on his kindness and trust, had seen him not as a person to love, but as a path to what she wanted. In that moment, sitting in my study with the evidence of Carly's true nature spread before me, I made a silent promise to Andy and to myself. This would end here. Carly would not harm another person the way she had hurt my son. I had spent my career ensuring that those who broke the law faced consequences. I might be retired now, but I still knew how justice worked, and I would see it done. I printed the key documents from Ben's report, adding them to my growing file. Tomorrow I would share them with Detective Martinez, with Andy, with our lawyer. But tonight I needed to process this information alone to prepare myself for the difficult conversations to come. As I finally headed to bed, I passed Andy's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see him sitting on the edge of his bed looking at something in his hands. I knocked gently. "Can I come in?" He looked up quickly, putting whatever he had been holding into his bedside drawer. "Of course, Mom." I sat beside him, noticing the redness around his eyes that suggested he had been crying. "I have some information about Carly that we need to discuss tomorrow," I said gently. "It's significant, but it can wait until morning." Andy nodded, then surprised me by reaching for my hand. "I keep thinking about what you said earlier about trust not being a weakness. I want to believe that. I need to believe that I can trust again someday." The vulnerability in his voice broke my heart. This strong, compassionate man who had dedicated his life to healing animals, now wounded in a way no physical medicine could treat. "You will," I assured him. "Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. The heart heals just like any other injury. It just takes time and proper care." He squeezed my hand, a small gesture of gratitude that said more than words could. As I left his room, I realized that despite the pain and upheaval of the past 24 hours, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. Not just for justice to be served, but for my son to find his way back to himself. To rebuild his life stronger than before, like those Japanese pottery pieces repaired with gold, where the broken places become the most beautiful. The wine glass had shattered, but what was breaking apart was not just crystal. It was the illusion that had trapped my son, the web of manipulation that had bound him. And from those fragments, we would build something new, something true. I slept soundly that night for the first time in months. Whatever came next, we would face it together with open eyes and the full force of truth behind us. "Miami Police Department. How can I help you?" The officer's voice through the phone was professionally detached, yet in that moment it represented my lifeline to justice, my connection to a system I had served faithfully for 3 decades. "This is Eleanor Miller. I'm calling regarding the assault case filed yesterday. I have additional information that may be relevant." My voice remained steady despite the weight of Ben's dossier sitting on my desk, a collection of secrets and lies that would forever change how my son viewed the woman he had married. "One moment, Judge Miller. I'll connect you with Detective Martinez." While waiting for the transfer, I glanced at the clock. 7:30 a.m. precisely. I had been awake since 5, reviewing the documents, organizing them in order of relevance. The file had grown substantial overnight, as Ben had sent several updates in the early hours. 3 previous marriages, each ending with Carly walking away with significant assets. A pattern of targeting men shortly after they experienced financial windfalls. A history of police calls that never quite resulted in charges. It painted a picture not just of opportunism, but of calculated predation. Detective Martinez speaking. "Detective, this is Judge Eleanor Miller. I've received information about my daughter-in-law that may change the nature of your investigation. I believe what happened in my dining room was not an isolated incident of alcohol-fueled rage, but part of a pattern of calculated behavior." "I'm listening, Judge." The detective's tone shifted subtly, more alert, more engaged. Even retired, my title still carried weight in law enforcement circles. "I've engaged a private investigator who has uncovered a disturbing history. 3 previous marriages, all to men with recent financial windfalls. All ended within 2 years with substantial settlements in her favor. And there's evidence she specifically targeted my son due to a family inheritance she believed he would receive." I kept my voice clinical, presenting facts as I would have in a courtroom. "That's significant. Can you bring this information to the station today?" "Of course, but there's more. I have reason to believe she may have committed financial fraud against my son. Systematic withdrawals from their joint account totaling over $40,000 in the past 3 months alone." The silence on the other end lasted only a moment. "Judge Miller, I think we need to expand this investigation. I'd like to involve our financial crimes unit. Can you and your son come in at 10 this morning?" "We'll be there." After hanging up, I stood at the window of my study watching the early morning light filter through the oak trees that lined my property. From this vantage point, I could see Andy in the garden below, kneeling beside one of my rose bushes. Gardening had always been his refuge during difficult times, even as a child. After his father died, he had spent weeks tending to the yard, as if bringing order to the landscape could somehow compensate for the chaos of grief. I made my way downstairs and out to the garden, carrying 2 cups of coffee. As I approached, I noticed Andy wasn't actually gardening. He was sitting still, staring at the roses without seeing them. The expression on his face was one I recognized from the mirror after my husband died, the stunned emptiness of someone whose reality has shattered overnight. "I've just spoken with Detective Martinez," I said, offering him a cup. "We need to go to the station at 10. There are some things you need to know about Carly before we go." Andy looked up, squinting against the morning sun. "What things? Let's go inside. I have documentation you should see." In the kitchen, I spread the files across the island counter: photographs, bank statements, marriage certificates, divorce decrees, police reports. Andy's face grew paler with each document he examined. 3 husbands before me. His finger traced the names on the marriage certificates. Stephen Harrington, Robert Keller, James Wright. I've never heard her mention any of them. According to the divorce records, she left each marriage with substantial assets. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Relationships began shortly after the men came into money. Marriages lasted less than 2 years. Divorces cited irreconcilable differences, with generous settlements negotiated. I pointed to the relevant documents, letting him absorb the information at his own pace. But what does this have to do with the glass? With what happened at dinner? His brow furrowed, still not seeing the complete picture. I handed him the final document printouts of internet searches from Carly's laptop, obtained through methods I chose not to question Ben about. She researched our family 6 months before you told me you were having financial difficulties. She was looking for information about my sister's estate, about what you might inherit. Andy's hand trembled slightly as he read the search terms. Judge Eleanor Miller inheritance, Margaret Miller estate value, how to access spouse inheritance, Florida marital property laws. Each query dated weeks before they had asked to move in with me. She married me for potential money. The disbelief in his voice was tinged with dawning comprehension. But I'm not even wealthy. I'm a veterinarian with student loans. You're not wealthy, no, but I am, or at least Carly thought I was. Margaret's estate was settled quietly, but there was a small mention in a legal publication last year. $12 million in property and investments, all passed to me as her only living sister. I hadn't shared this information with Andy, previously maintaining the financial privacy my parents had instilled in me. Andy's eyes widened. 12 million, Aunt Margaret had that kind of money, but she lived so simply. She was a shrewd investor who never saw the point in displaying her wealth, a trait that apparently runs in the family. I offered a small, sad smile. I suspect Carly found that article and saw you as the pathway to what she assumed would eventually be yours. The questions about your will, the sudden interest in your retirement plans. Andy's voice was hollow as pieces fell into place. I thought she was just concerned about our future, about how we would manage if you needed care someday. She was concerned about your future, just not in the way you imagined. I reached for his hand across the counter. Andy, there's something else you need to know. I've reviewed your bank statements. The withdrawals from your joint account, they weren't for household expenses. He looked up sharply. What do you mean? The money was transferred to a private account in her name only, an account you weren't aware of. I slid the bank statement toward him. Over $40,000 in the past 3 months. The color drained completely from his face. That's almost all of our savings, the money we were supposedly saving for our own place. His voice cracked on the last word. The detective wants to involve the Financial Crimes Unit. There's enough evidence here to support charges of financial fraud in addition to the assault. I kept my tone gentle but firm. He needed to understand the gravity of what we were dealing with. Andy stared at the documents spread before him, the physical evidence of betrayal more damning than any emotional suspicion could have been. When he finally looked up, something had changed in his eyes. The hurt was still there, but alongside it was a hardening resolve I hadn't seen in years. Let's go to the station. I want her charged with everything possible. At the police station, Detective Martinez introduced us to Detective Ramirez from the Financial Crimes Unit, a meticulous man with wire-rimmed glasses and a manner that suggested he found particular satisfaction in following money trails. They led us to a conference room where the evidence we had brought was carefully cataloged and copied. Based on what you've provided, we're looking at multiple charges here, Ramirez explained. Simple assault from the incident with the glass, financial fraud for the unauthorized transfers. And given the pattern established with her previous marriages, we may be able to make a case for premeditated fraud, essentially, that she entered the marriage with the specific intent to gain access to family assets. Will it be enough to hold her? I asked, the former judge in me automatically assessing the strength of the case. The assault charge alone wouldn't typically result in extended detention, Martinez admitted. But combined with the financial crimes and the flight risk these patterns suggest, we'll request remand or at minimum a substantial bail with surrender of her passport. As they continued outlining the legal strategy, I watched Andy. He sat slightly apart from us, his attention fixed on a photograph of Carly that had been included in the file, her professional headshot from the marketing firm where she worked. In it, she looked polished, confident, with none of the volatile anger we had witnessed. I wondered what he saw when he looked at that image now. The woman he had loved, the stranger who had deceived him, or some complicated amalgamation of truth and illusion that he was still struggling to untangle. There's one more thing you should know. Detective Ramirez's voice pulled my attention back to the conversation. We've found that Ms. Miller, or Ms. Carlson as she was born, has been in contact with a known associate from her past, a man named Victor Delgado who was investigated though never charged in connection with an identity theft ring 3 years ago. You think she's working with someone? The question came from Andy, his first contribution to the discussion. We're exploring that possibility. The patterns are too consistent, too professional to be entirely the work of one person operating in isolation. Ramirez adjusted his glasses. The timing of certain transfers aligns with meetings she had with Delgado, according to her cell phone location data. The implications hung in the air. This wasn't just about a woman with anger issues and financial desperation. This was potentially part of a larger, more organized scheme. What happens now? Andy asked, his voice steady despite the new information. We're bringing Ms. Miller back in for additional questioning today. Given these developments, we'll be seeking to upgrade the charges and requesting a higher bail amount or remand. Martinez gathered her notes. In the meantime, we recommend you continue to monitor your accounts for any unusual activity. As we prepared to leave, Ramirez handed me his card. Judge Miller, given your background, I know you understand the importance of documentation. If you or your son remember anything else unusual, phone calls, unexpected visitors, any behavior that seemed odd in retrospect, please contact me immediately. Outside the station, Andy seemed simultaneously drained and energized, as if the weight of understanding had both exhausted and galvanized him. I need to go to the clinic, he said. I had already arranged for coverage today, but I should check in, let them know I'll be back tomorrow. Are you sure you're ready for that? I was concerned about his emotional state, about his ability to focus on work while processing such profound betrayal. I need normalcy, Mom. Something that makes sense. Animals make sense to me in a way people apparently don't. The bitterness in his voice was new, a protective shell forming around his wounded trust. I understand. Why don't you take my car? I have some calls to make, and then I'd like to visit an old colleague. I handed him the keys. Just be careful. Carly will likely be released on bail by this afternoon. Do you think she'll try to contact me? For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his face. The restraining order prohibits any contact, but that doesn't mean she won't try. Don't answer calls from numbers you don't recognize. Don't open emails from unfamiliar addresses. The advice came automatically, drawn from years of protecting vulnerable witnesses. And Andy, don't engage if she does reach out, no matter what she says or promises. He nodded, the determination in his jaw belying the uncertainty in his eyes. As he drove away, I watched until the car turned the corner, a familiar maternal worry settling in my chest. He was a grown man, capable and intelligent. But in that moment, he was also my child, wounded in a way I couldn't simply bandage or soothe away. Back home, I made a series of calls, first to my financial advisor to verify that my accounts were secure, then to my attorney to discuss the potential for civil action to recover Andy's stolen funds, and finally to Justice Mercer. Ruth answered on the second ring, her voice warm with friendship. Eleanor, I was just thinking about you. How did the mentorship program discussion go with the Bar Association? It's on hold for the moment, Ruth. I'm dealing with a family situation, one that may require your particular expertise. Ruth had spent her later career focusing on financial crimes against the elderly and vulnerable adults before her appointment to the Supreme Court. Tell me what you need. I outlined the situation with Carly, the emerging pattern of predatory marriages, the potential connection to organized fraud. I'm concerned this goes beyond just my son and his wife. If she's part of a larger operation targeting families with assets, you're thinking this could be similar to the Whitmore case. Ruth's voice sharpened with recognition. The Whitmore case had been a groundbreaking prosecution 5 years ago, a ring of con artists who specialized in identifying and exploiting wealthy families through strategic marriages and relationships. The parallels are concerning. The targeting based on financial research, the rapid escalation once legally connected to the assets, the extraction and transfer of funds to separate accounts. I had reviewed the Whitmore case files that morning, the similarities too striking to ignore. I'll make some calls, Eleanor. There are people still tracking offshoots from that network. If your daughter-in-law is connected, they'll want to know. Ruth's tone shifted from friend to jurist. And Eleanor, be careful. If this is indeed related to Whitmore, these people don't respond well to exposure. After our call, I drove to the offices of Reeves Investigations. Ben's workplace reflected his personality, efficient, unadorned with an understated professionalism that belied the sophisticated technology and networks at his disposal. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman who had worked with him for decades, led me directly to his office without announcement. Ben stood as I entered, his weathered face creasing in a brief smile. "Judge, I was expecting your call, not a personal visit." "Some conversations shouldn't happen over the phone, Ben." I took the seat he offered. "I need to know everything you found about Victor Delgado and any other associates connected to Carly." Ben nodded, retrieving a file from his desk. "Delgado is interesting. Former finance guy who lost his license after some creative accounting for clients. Now he presents himself as a wealth consultant, whatever that means." He spread photographs on the desk, surveillance shots of a well-dressed man in his 40s meeting with Carly at various locations over the past year. "They're careful. Public meetings always in crowded places like malls or restaurants. But there's a pattern to the timing they meet, and within 48 hours, there's a transfer from your son's joint account to Carly's private account." Ben pointed to a timeline he had constructed correlating the meetings with the bank records. "Is Delgado connected to her previous marriages?" I examined the photos carefully, memorizing the face of the man who had helped exploit my son. "That's where it gets interesting. I can place him in the same city during at least 2 of her previous relationships. Not definitive proof of involvement, but certainly suspicious." Ben leaned back in his chair. "I'm still digging into the connections between Delgado and a few other players who might be part of a larger network. There's a woman named Sofia Vega, who appears to be a coordinator of sorts. She's been photographed with both Delgado and 3 other individuals who have similar patterns of targeting wealthy families." The detectives mentioned the Whitmore case as a possible connection. Ben's eyebrows rose slightly. "That tracks. The methods are similar, though this group seems to have learned from Whitmore's mistakes. They're more patient, more careful about digital footprints." He hesitated, then added, "Judge, if they are connected to Whitmore, you and your son need to be extremely cautious. That network was never fully dismantled." "What's your assessment of the immediate risk?" I needed his unvarnished opinion. "To you personally, moderate. They prefer financial exploitation to physical confrontation. But now that you've involved law enforcement and the fraud has been exposed," he spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty, "people get unpredictable when their freedom is threatened. I'd recommend security measures for both you and your son until this is resolved." I nodded, having already reached the same conclusion. "I'll arrange it. In the meantime, I need you to continue tracking Delgado's movements, especially now that Carly has been arrested. If they're working together, he may try to make contact or coordinate her defense." Ben agreed, promising updates as information developed. As I stood to leave, he handed me a small device. "A signal jammer. It will prevent anyone from remotely accessing the electronics in your home computers, phones, even some newer appliances. These groups often use digital surveillance. This won't stop everything, but it's a start." I took the device, thanking him for his thoroughness. On the drive home, I found myself checking the rearview mirror more frequently than usual, a new vigilance activated by the knowledge that what had seemed like a domestic dispute was potentially the tip of a much larger criminal enterprise. When I arrived home, Andy's car was already in the driveway. My car technically, though I had always thought of it as his, since he drove it more often than I did. Inside, I found him in the kitchen, mechanically preparing sandwiches as if the familiar task could somehow restore normalcy to a world turned upside down. "How was the clinic?" I asked, setting my bag down on the counter. "Busy. Hectic. Exactly what I needed." He handed me a sandwich. "The work helped. Animals don't lie or manipulate. They just need help, and either you can provide it or you can't." "And your colleagues?" I had been concerned about the inevitable questions, the sympathetic looks that can sometimes be more difficult to bear than outright hostility. "Dr. Patel asked about my family emergency. I told him the truth that Carly has been arrested for assault and fraud, that our marriage is over, and that I'd appreciate not discussing it further." The matter-of-fact way he delivered this information suggested he had moved beyond shock into a kind of functional numbness. He was surprisingly supportive, offered me extra shifts if I need the distraction. We ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Andy spoke again. "I checked the mail on the way in. There was a letter from the county clerk's office. They've scheduled a hearing for the restraining order next Tuesday." "That's standard procedure. The emergency order is temporary. The hearing will determine if it becomes permanent." I kept my tone informational rather than concerned. Will I have to see her speak to her? The question revealed the anxiety beneath his composed exterior. You'll need to be present, yes, but you won't have to interact directly. Your statement and the evidence will speak for themselves. I reached across the table, covering his hand with mine. Andy, you should know the investigation has expanded. There's evidence Carly may be working with others as part of a larger fraud operation. His eyes widened slightly, but the news seemed to confirm something he had already been considering. That actually makes more sense than her acting alone. Carly is smart, but some of this feels professionally executed. Like the way she managed to isolate me from friends who might have noticed changes in my behavior. The police are investigating a man named Victor Delgado, who appears to have been coordinating with her. I showed him the photographs Ben had provided, watching carefully for his reaction. Andy studied the images, recognition slowly dawning. I've seen him at the farmer's market about a month ago. Carly said he was a colleague from work who happened to be there with his wife. His face hardened. There was no wife, just the two of them talking intensely until they noticed me approaching. Then suddenly they were discussing organic tomatoes. This new connection confirmed our suspicions Delgado had been more involved in their daily life than we had initially realized. It also raised new concerns about how much information about our household, our routines, might have been shared. Andy, I think we need to take additional security precautions. If this is indeed connected to the Whitmore network, they may not respond well to having their operation exposed. I explained Ben's recommendations, the signal jammer, the suggestion for enhanced home security. Rather than being alarmed, Andy seemed almost relieved by the concrete steps we could take. I'll contact a security company today, and I've already changed all my passwords, frozen my credit, and set up alerts for any new account applications. His proactive response surprised me, though. Perhaps it shouldn't have. Andy had always been methodical in his approach to problems. It was what made him an excellent veterinarian. Once he understood a situation, he could compartmentalize his emotions and focus on practical solutions. There's something else, he added, hesitation creeping into his voice for the first time. I found something in Carly's desk drawer last night when I was looking for our marriage certificate for the lawyer. He retrieved a small notebook from his pocket. It's some kind of code or shorthand. Names, dates, figures. I didn't understand it at first, but after what you've told me, I examined the notebook. The entries were indeed cryptic combinations of initials, numbers, and symbols that wouldn't mean anything to a casual observer. But with the context of what we now knew, patterns emerged. EM12MIHTAC, I read aloud. Eleanor Miller, 12 million inheritance trust acquisition complete. The clinical analysis of my own family as targets sent a chill through me despite the warm kitchen. And this one, AMVS3Y low, Andy pointed to another entry. That's me, I think. AM for Andy Miller. VS might be veterinary salary. 3Y could be 3 years, about how long we've been together. And low return on investment, I finished grimly. They were assessing whether you were worth their time without access to my estate. The notebook contained similar entries for what appeared to be other targets, potential victims categorized and prioritized according to accessible wealth and vulnerability. It was methodical, cold, and utterly dehumanizing. We need to get this to Detective Ramirez immediately, I said, already reaching for my phone. This could help identify other victims and provide evidence of an organized operation. As I dialed, Andy stared at the notebook, his expression hardening from shock to anger. How many lives has she destroyed? How many families torn apart like ours? Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with an incoming text. Detective Martinez with urgent news. Carly had been released on bail despite the prosecution's objections. The judge had set bail at $100,000, which had been posted immediately by an associate who matched Delgado's description. The conditions included surrender of her passport and an electronic monitoring bracelet, but she was out. What does this mean for us? Andy asked after I shared the update. It means we need to be vigilant. The restraining order is still in effect. She can't come within 500 feet of either of us or this house. But we should operate under the assumption that she or her associates will be monitoring our movements. I texted Ramirez about the notebook, arranging for an officer to collect it immediately. While waiting for the police, we conducted a thorough sweep of the house, checking for any surveillance devices that might have been planted during the months Carly had lived with us. The signal jammer Ben had provided offered some protection, but physical devices could still be present. The search yielded nothing obvious until Andy checked the smoke detector in their former bedroom. Inside, nestled against the battery, was a tiny microphone professionally installed and nearly invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. "How long has this been here?" he whispered, the violation of our private space adding a new dimension to the betrayal. We continued searching, eventually finding 3 more devices, one in the living room light fixture, one in my study, hidden in a bookshelf, and one in the kitchen underneath the island counter. Each discovery deepened our understanding of how thoroughly we had been surveilled, how carefully our conversations and activities had been monitored. When Officer Chen arrived to collect the notebook, we showed him the devices as well. "This definitely escalates things," he commented carefully, bagging each item as evidence. "This level of surveillance suggests organized criminal activity, not just opportunistic fraud." After he left, Andy and I sat in the living room. The signal jammer activated, creating a bubble of privacy in our own home that had been missing for months without our knowledge. "I feel violated," Andy said, finally breaking the heavy silence. "Not just by the deception, the fraud, the assault, but by the realization that every private moment, every conversation we had in this house might have been monitored and analyzed, used against us." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "I understand," I replied, remembering similar cases I had presided over, victims of stalking and surveillance, who described the persistent psychological damage of knowing they had been watched, their private lives exposed without consent. "It will take time to rebuild that sense of security, to trust the privacy of your own home again." Andy nodded, his gaze fixed on the window where the afternoon sun cast dappled shadows across the floor. "You know what's strange? Part of me still wants to believe there was something real in our relationship, some genuine connection that wasn't just calculation and manipulation." He turned to me, his expression raw with vulnerability. "Is that pathetic, to still want to believe in some goodness in someone who has proven themselves entirely untrustworthy?" "It's not pathetic, Andy. It's human." I moved to sit beside him on the sofa. "The capacity to see the potential for good in others, even when they've harmed you, that's not weakness. It's a profound strength that speaks to your character, not hers." My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. It was Detective Ramirez, his usually measured voice tinged with urgency. "Judge Miller, we've made a significant breakthrough. The notebook your son found contains codes that match records seized in a previous investigation into organized fraud. We believe we can now connect Carly Miller directly to at least 7 other cases across 3 states. 7 other families," I repeated for Andy's benefit. "Has she been charged with these additional crimes?" "We're preparing those charges now, but there's a complication: we can't locate her." Ramirez's pause spoke volumes. "The electronic monitoring bracelet was found in a shopping mall parking lot an hour ago. She appears to have disabled it and disappeared." "How is that possible?" "You had her passport." The judicial part of my brain was already cataloging the failures in procedure that could have allowed this to happen. "We believe she had false identification documents prepared in advance, possibly left for her by Delgado, who we also cannot locate." Ramirez's frustration was palpable. "Judge Miller, until we apprehend her, I strongly recommend you and your son take additional precautions. We're assigning a patrol car to your neighborhood, but you should consider temporary relocation to a secure location." After ending the call, I relayed the information to Andy, whose face had drained of color. "She's gone just like that." "Not for long," I assured him with more confidence than I felt. "Every law enforcement agency in the state will be looking for her now. This isn't just about us anymore. This is about a criminal enterprise that has victimized multiple families." Andy stood abruptly, pacing the length of the living room. "We should have seen this coming. The bail amount wasn't nearly high enough given the scope of the crimes. Of course she had an escape plan ready." His veterinarian's mind, so adept at anticipating complications in animal health, was now applying the same analytical focus to our security situation. "We need to decide whether to stay here or move temporarily to a hotel or safe house," I said, already mentally listing the pros and cons of each option. "I'm not running." Andy's voice was firm, a new resolve hardening his features. "This is our home. We've already changed the locks, found the surveillance devices. We'll improve security further, but I won't be driven out by fear." His stance surprised me. This wasn't the conflict-avoidant son I had observed in recent months. This was the return of something I had feared was lost: his innate courage, his refusal to be intimidated. "Then we'll stay," I agreed. "But we'll take every precaution. No routines, no predictable patterns, and we'll have the security system upgraded today." As if on cue, my phone chimed with a text from Ben. He had been monitoring Delgado's known associates and had information about possible safe houses they might use. He was sharing this with the police, but wanted us informed as well. The message included a warning. These people are cornered. Expect escalation. I showed the text to Andy, watching his reaction carefully. Instead of fear, his expression reflected grim determination. Then we'll be ready for them. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of practical preparations. A security company installed a comprehensive system, cameras, motion sensors, reinforced doors. Ben arranged for a private security guard to watch the house overnight. We established communication protocols, safe words, emergency contacts. By evening, our home had been transformed into a fortress of sorts, but the emotional landscape had shifted even more dramatically. Andy, who 24 hours earlier had been reeling from shock and betrayal, now moved with purpose, his initial devastation channeled into focused action. As we sat in the kitchen that evening, reviewing security measures over a hastily prepared dinner, Andy surprised me with a question. Do you think we could use this against them, turn their own tactics back on them? What do you mean? I asked, intrigued by this unexpected direction. They've been 10 steps ahead of us this whole time because they had information about our finances, our routines, our vulnerabilities. He leaned forward, an intensity in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. What if we feed them false information, make them think there's something valuable here that needs to be retrieved immediately? A trap, I said slowly, considering the implications. Using their greed against them. Exactly. Andy's expression was calculating, now strategizing. If Carly believes there's evidence here that could expose the entire network or access to accounts she hasn't yet breached. The idea was risky but potentially effective. I thought of the cases I had presided over where similar strategies had been employed by law enforcement to draw out fugitives, controlled circumstances carefully monitored with overwhelming force, ready to intervene. We would need to coordinate with the police, I cautioned. This isn't something we could or should attempt on our own. Of course, Andy nodded quickly. But we have something they want: knowledge of their operation, evidence they haven't been able to destroy. We should use that. I studied my son, seeing a strength emerging from the crucible of betrayal, not hardness or cynicism, but a clear-eyed determination that acknowledged danger without succumbing to fear. I'll call Ramirez in the morning. If he agrees, we'll develop a plan. Later that night, as I prepared for bed in a house that felt simultaneously more secure and more vulnerable than ever, my phone rang. The number was blocked, but something prompted me to answer, rather than let it go to voicemail. Eleanor Miller. I kept my voice neutral, giving nothing away. Judge Miller. The voice was male, unfamiliar with the slight accent I associated with South Florida. You've become quite a problem for some mutual acquaintances of ours. Mr. Delgado, I presume. I maintained the calm demeanor that had served me well on the bench, even as I signaled to Andy, who had appeared in my doorway, to begin recording the call. Names aren't important. What matters is that you understand the situation you've created. Your interference has jeopardized a substantial operation. That makes certain people uncomfortable. The threat was implied rather than stated directly, a careful choice that reflected experience with law enforcement monitoring. If you're calling to intimidate me, you should know that never worked in my courtroom, and it certainly won't work in my home. I infused my voice with the authority that had once silenced the most arrogant attorneys. Every law enforcement agency in the state is looking for you and your associate. The evidence we've provided connects you to frauds across 3 states. Your operation is finished. A soft laugh came through the phone. Judge with respect, you've seen only the surface. Ms. Miller was one operative among many. Even if your son's unfortunate marriage ends in disappointment, our work continues. His tone shifted, became almost conversational. I'm calling to offer a solution that benefits everyone, a mutual cessation of hostilities. I'm listening. I kept him talking, knowing that every second prolonged the call, increasing the chance of a trace. Withdraw your complaints. Tell the police the assault was a misunderstanding, the financial issues a matter for divorce court rather than criminal proceedings. In exchange, you and your son will be left in peace. Ms. Miller will disappear from your lives permanently. The offer was delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to negotiating his way out of difficult situations. And if we decline this generous offer, I asked, my sarcasm barely concealed, then this becomes unnecessarily complicated for everyone involved. The pretense of civility slipped, revealing the steel beneath. You've had a distinguished career, Judge Miller. It would be a shame to see that legacy tarnished by scandal. And your son, a veterinarian's reputation is so dependent on community trust. Allegations of domestic violence, even false ones, can be devastating. The threat was now explicit. They would attempt to destroy us professionally and personally if we continued to pursue justice. It was the desperate move of someone whose carefully constructed criminal enterprise was at risk of exposure. Mr. Delgado, let me be perfectly clear. I spent 30 years sending people like you to prison. Threats don't intimidate me, they simply provide additional evidence for the prosecution. I nodded to Andy, who was already texting Ramirez about the call. Every word of this conversation is being recorded and will be in the hands of the FBI within minutes. You've just elevated this from state charges to federal witness intimidation. A beat of silence suggested this development had not been anticipated. When Delgado spoke again, the false civility had vanished entirely. You've made a serious mistake, Judge. One you'll regret. The call disconnected abruptly. Andy lowered his phone, the recording safely captured. That was definitely Delgado, the same voice I heard at the farmer's market. I nodded, already dialing Ramirez's direct number. This changes things. Witness intimidation across state lines is a federal offense. This just became much bigger than a domestic assault case. As I briefed Ramirez on the call arranged for the recording to be transferred securely and discussed immediate security responses, I watched Andy. He stood by the window looking out at the night, his posture straight, shoulders set. Not with fear, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had faced the worst and found himself still standing. In that moment, despite the danger, despite the upheaval of everything we had known, I felt a profound sense of certainty. Whatever came next, whether Carly and Delgado were apprehended quickly, or whether this became a protracted battle, we would face it together with clear eyes and unbroken spirits. The wine glass had shattered, but what was emerging from the fragments was stronger than what had been broken. The courtroom fell silent as Carly was led in her prison uniform, hanging loose on her thinner frame. 3 months had passed since that night in my dining room, 3 months of investigations, evidence gathering, and legal maneuvering. The woman who stood before the court now bore little resemblance to the polished, confident marketing executive who had married my son. Her once perfectly dyed hair now showed gray roots, her posture slightly stooped as if the weight of her exposed crimes physically pressed down on her. Andy sat beside me in the gallery, his face a careful mask of neutrality. He had prepared for this moment, with his therapist practicing the compartmentalization techniques that would allow him to face his wife without crumbling. When Carly's gaze swept the courtroom and landed on him, he didn't flinch, just held her stare with a steadiness that spoke of healing beginning to take root. All rise, the Honorable Judge Martin presiding. The proceedings moved with the methodical precision I remembered from my years on the bench. What had once been a simple assault case had expanded into something far more significant. A multi-state fraud investigation that had uncovered a network of at least 12 operatives targeting wealthy families across Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. The charges against Carly now included assault, financial fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, and witness intimidation. After the dramatic events following Delgado's threatening phone call, the case had accelerated rapidly. The FBI had tracked Delgado to a safe house in Savannah within 48 hours, where they found not only him, but documentation linking the operation to 3 other fraud rings across the country. Carly had been apprehended trying to cross into Canada with false identification 3 days later. The evidence was overwhelming, leaving her with few options. Today's hearing would determine whether she would accept the plea agreement offered by the prosecution, 2 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release in exchange for testimony against Delgado and the other higher-level operators of the scheme. In the case of United States versus Caroline Miller, are the parties ready to proceed with the plea hearing? Judge Martin's voice carried the same authoritative tone I had once used in this very courtroom. The prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Jensen, whom I had mentored early in her career, stood. The government is ready, Your Honor. Carly's attorney, a public defender who had inherited the case after her private attorney withdrew upon learning the extent of the charges, rose next. The defense is ready, Your Honor. What followed was a detailed recitation of the crimes Carly had committed, not just against Andy and me, but against multiple victims across 3 states. Each charge was read aloud, each piece of evidence summarized for the record. Andy tensed beside me as details of their personal life were exposed in the clinical language of the court, but he remained composed, his eyes fixed on Carly as if trying to reconcile the woman before him with the person he thought he had married. Judge Martin turned his attention directly to Carly. Mrs. Miller, do you understand that by pleading guilty you're admitting to committing the crimes of financial fraud, battery, and violation of a court order? Carly's voice was rougher than I remembered, stripped of its practiced charm. Yes, Your Honor. And are you doing so voluntarily aware of the consequences? Yes. Very well. This court accepts your plea of guilty and sentences you to 2 years of incarceration, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. The specific terms of the probation include an absolute prohibition of contact with the victims, mandatory participation in anger management programs, and alcohol dependency treatment, in addition to financial restitution, as stipulated in the civil agreement. Judge Martin struck his gavel, finalizing the sentence. As the officers approached to take her away, Carly turned toward our direction one last time. "Andy," she called out, ignoring the guard's warnings. "I'm sorry for everything." Andy did not respond verbally. He only held her gaze for a few seconds before looking away. It was the closure he needed, not a pardon, not a reconciliation, just the silent acknowledgement that this chapter was ending. In the hallway after the hearing ended, Andy finally released my hand and took a deep breath. "I thought it would be harder," he confessed. "Seeing her like that, hearing her beg. But I could only think of everything we discovered, the other people, the lies, the inheritance searches." "You were very strong," I said, feeling immense pride for my son. "I don't feel strong," he replied honestly. "I feel stupid for having fallen for this, for not having seen the signs." "You're not stupid. You were manipulated by someone who turned manipulation into an art form." I gestured toward the building exit. "Let's go home. This phase is over now, but healing takes time." On the way back, we stopped at a hardware store. Andy had decided to repaint his room, a symbolic act of a new beginning. He chose a soft blue, almost sky blue. "The color of the sky after the storm passes," as he described it. The following days brought an almost therapeutic routine. During the day, we dealt with the legal matters, meetings with the lawyer, visits to the bank to resolve the financial issues, filling out forms for the criminal complaints. At night, we painted Andy's room, moved furniture, renewed the space that had been his in childhood and adolescence, and that would now be his refuge for healing. But the path forward wasn't smooth. 6 weeks after the sentencing, I found Andy sitting in the dark in his newly painted room, staring at the wall. He had returned early from the veterinary clinic, something he rarely did. "What happened?" I asked, sitting beside him on the bed. "A client recognized me from the news coverage of the trial. Started asking questions about Carly, about how I could have been fooled so easily." His voice was flat, drained of emotion. "Then he asked if I was sure I should be treating his dog, given my poor judgment with people." The cruelty of the comment struck like a physical blow. This was the reality many victims faced, not just the trauma of the abuse itself, but the subsequent judgment from those who couldn't understand how someone could find themselves in such a situation. Dr. Patel stepped in, told the guy he could take his business elsewhere if he couldn't treat the staff with respect. Andy ran a hand through his hair. "But it made me realize this isn't going away. This is part of my story now, whether I want it to be or not." That evening marked a turning point. Instead of allowing the stigma to push him further into isolation, Andy began researching resources for victims of domestic and financial abuse, particularly focusing on male victims who often fell through the cracks of support systems. Did you know that nearly half of all domestic violence victims are men, but less than 1% of funding for shelters and support services is allocated to male victims? He asked, one morning, laptop open at the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts and statistics. And when you add financial abuse to the equation, the numbers get even worse because of the stigma. Men are supposed to be financially savvy and control. Admitting you've been financially exploited by a partner is seen as a double failure. His research became more targeted, more focused. He reached out to other victims identified in the investigation, offering support and connection. What began as informal conversations evolved into regular online meetings, but these efforts weren't without setbacks. No one showed up to the first support group meeting. Andy admitted returning home earlier than expected one evening 3 months after the sentencing. I reserved the community room at the library, brought coffee and materials, sat there for an hour alone. The disappointment was evident in his voice, but rather than discouraging him, it seemed to strengthen his resolve. I need to understand why men don't seek help, why they suffer in silence even when resources are available. He redoubled his efforts, consulting with established domestic violence organizations about effective outreach strategies, reading academic research on barriers to help-seeking behavior among male victims. Each obstacle became a problem to solve rather than a reason to quit. 4 months after Carly's sentencing, Andy organized a panel discussion at the local community college featuring a psychologist specializing in domestic abuse, a financial counselor, and himself as a survivor. The event drew a modest audience, mostly students required to attend for class credit, and a few social service professionals. Not exactly the turnout I hoped for, he admitted as we packed up afterward. But 3 men approached me privately after everyone left. They recognized their own situations in what I described. That alone makes it worthwhile. These small victories fueled his growing passion. By the 5-month mark, Andy had established an online forum for survivors, created educational materials on recognizing financial abuse, and begun building connections with local law enforcement and social service agencies. He named his fledgling organization New Beginnings, a nod to his own journey from victim to advocate. "I need to do this, Mom," he explained as we reviewed the incorporation paperwork spread across the dining room table, the same table where Carly had thrown the wine glass, now reclaimed as a space for healing and growth. Not just for me, but for all the others who feel alone, who don't know where to turn. I supported him fully, offering my legal expertise for the incorporation process and connecting him with contacts from my judicial career who might provide resources or guidance. Andy approached the project with the same meticulous care he brought to his veterinary practice, researching best practices, consulting with established organizations, identifying gaps in existing services. 6 months after the sentencing, New Beginnings faced its first significant challenge. Andy had submitted a grant application to a local foundation that supported community service organizations. The rejection letter cited insufficient organizational track record and concerns about sustainability, standard language that nonetheless struck a blow to Andy's growing confidence in his mission. "Maybe I'm being naive," he said, tossing the letter aside. "Thinking I can build something meaningful from such a personal tragedy. Maybe this is just my way of avoiding dealing with my own issues. Or maybe," I countered, "you're experiencing what every new organization faces, the uphill battle of establishing credibility. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither are effective support networks." The rejection prompted Andy to reevaluate his approach. Instead of trying to build New Beginnings as a standalone entity, immediately he approached established organizations with proposals for partnership, offering his perspective as a male survivor to enhance their existing programs while gradually building New Beginnings' reputation. This strategic pivot proved successful. 7 months after the sentencing, a respected women's shelter invited Andy to help develop a program specifically for male victims of domestic and financial abuse, the first such initiative in our county. The collaboration gave New Beginnings legitimacy, while allowing Andy to implement his ideas within an existing framework. "It's not exactly what I envisioned," he admitted as we celebrated the partnership with a quiet dinner at home. "But it's a start. And maybe this is better learning from people who've been doing this work for decades before trying to reinvent the wheel." His humility and willingness to adapt impressed me. This wasn't the Andy who had moved into my house with Carly, unsure of himself, seeking approval, easily influenced. This was a man who had been broken, but had found a new kind of strength in the process of rebuilding. 9 months after the sentencing, Andy received an unexpected email, an invitation to speak at a state conference on domestic violence and financial abuse. The organizer had attended a training session Andy had conducted for the shelter staff and been impressed by his perspective. "They want me to give a 30-minute talk about my experience and the gaps in support services for male victims," he said, staring at his phone in disbelief. "This is a major conference, Mom. Policymakers attend this, funding organizations, people who could really help expand what we're trying to do. You should accept," I encouraged, seeing the mixture of excitement and apprehension in his face. "Your story needs to be heard at exactly that level." The weeks leading up to the conference were filled with preparation, drafting and redrafting his speech, anticipating questions, practicing delivery. Despite his growing confidence in his mission, public speaking remained outside his comfort zone. "What if I'm not eloquent enough?" he asked as we rehearsed his presentation in the living room. "What if I freeze in the middle and look like an amateur?" "Then you take a deep breath, take a sip of water, and continue," I replied. "Remember, you're not there to impress anyone with your perfect public speaking. You're there to share a truth that can help other people." On the day of the conference, I sat in the audience watching my son step onto the stage. He wore a simple but elegant blue suit, his hair tied back in a professional bun. Despite his nerves, he looked confident, centered. "My name is Andrew Miller," he began, "and today I'm going to share with you how a broken glass of wine saved my life." For 40 minutes, he kept the audience completely engaged, alternating between moments of raw vulnerability when describing his own abuse and precise analysis of how the system often fails to recognize and address financial abuse. He didn't shy away from the uncomfortable truths, how his gender had made it harder for others to recognize his victimization, how shame had kept him silent, how isolation had been weaponized against him. "We talk about physical bruises as evidence of abuse," he said at one point, his voice steady and clear. "But financial exploitation, emotional manipulation, systematic isolation, these leave invisible bruises that can be just as damaging, just as painful, and far more difficult for others to recognize and validate." He concluded with a call for more education, better laws, and greater awareness. The standing ovation he received when he finished lasted several minutes, a powerful validation of his message and his courage in delivering it. As I watched, I felt tears in my eyes, not of sadness, but of a deep and overwhelming pride. My son had transformed his pain into purpose, his experience into wisdom. After the talk, as we prepared to leave, Andy was approached by an older woman, elegantly dressed with a badge identifying her as a representative of a philanthropic foundation. "Mr. Miller, your presentation was extraordinary," the woman said. "I'm impressed with the work you and your organization are doing. I'd like to discuss the possibility of funding to expand New Beginnings." Andy looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise and hope. I nodded encouragingly. "That would be wonderful," Andy replied. "We have so many ideas to reach more people, especially in rural areas where resources are scarce." They exchanged cards, agreeing to a meeting for the following week. As we walked toward the parking lot, Andy seemed to be floating with excitement. "Can you believe it? Real funding to expand the project? We could create materials in different languages, develop an app for secure financial tracking, maybe even open a small dedicated office." "You deserve it, Andy," I replied. "You worked hard and you're making a difference in the lives of so many people." He stopped suddenly in the middle of the parking lot and hugged me, a strong hug full of gratitude. "None of this would have been possible without you, Mom. Without your strength that night, without your persistence afterward, without your support throughout this entire process." I returned the hug, feeling the peculiar sensation that only mothers know, pride and nostalgia, simultaneously seeing your child grow beyond what you could ever have imagined. "You always had that strength inside you, Andy. You just needed to rediscover it." The meeting with the Foundation representative, Rebecca Winters, took place the following week. She had come prepared with detailed questions about New Beginnings' mission structure and goals, the kind of thorough vetting that suggested serious interest rather than mere curiosity. The discussion concluded with a verbal commitment to a 2-year grant, not the millions Andy had initially dreamed of, but a solid $175,000 that would allow him to rent a small office space, develop educational materials, and hire a part-time coordinator to manage the growing demand for services. 1 year after Carly's sentencing, New Beginnings had established itself as a respected voice in the domestic violence prevention community. The small office Andy had rented with the grant money had become a hub for training, education, and support. He had reduced his hours at the veterinary clinic to part-time, dedicating the remainder of his week to building the organization. The journey hadn't been linear. There had been setbacks along the way, funding challenges, skepticism from traditional service providers, personal moments of doubt. Each obstacle had been met with determination rather than defeat. Each failure transformed into a lesson that strengthened the organization's foundation. Most significantly, Andy had moved into his own apartment 6 months after the sentencing, a 1-bedroom space near his office, modestly furnished, but distinctly his. The move had been another step in his journey toward independence and self-redefinition. That night, as I drove back home alone after attending New Beginnings' first anniversary celebration, I reflected on the events of the past year. The assault with the glass, the police report, the discovery of the financial crimes, Carly's arrest, Andy's gradual recovery, and now this promising new chapter. It was impossible not to think about how a moment of violence, terrible as it was, had triggered a series of events that brought not only justice, but also healing and purpose. The broken glass had shattered more than crystal that night. It had broken the power Carly had over Andy, the lies that had built their relationship, and the illusion that abuse only happens to other people. I parked in the garage, entered the house, and turned on the lights. The silence greeted me no longer, an oppressive silence of loneliness, or the tense silence that had preceded the assault that night, but a peaceful silence of a life that had weathered the storm and found serenity on the other side. Making my way to the kitchen, I noticed something on the dining room table, a small gift box with a card in Andy's handwriting. Inside the box was a crystal wine glass exquisitely crafted but deliberately different from the one that had been shattered a year ago. The card read, "Mom, this glass is not a replacement for what was broken, but a symbol of what has been built. Something new, something stronger. Thank you for showing me that when life breaks us, we get to decide how to put ourselves back together. With love and endless gratitude, Andy." I placed the glass gently on the shelf where my grandmother's crystal had once stood, a tangible reminder that endings can also be beginnings. The wine glass that shattered a year ago had marked the end of one chapter in our lives, but it had also opened the door to something neither of us could have anticipated: a purpose born from pain, a mission emerging from betrayal, a strength discovered in vulnerability. As I made a cup of tea and sat on the deck watching the starry sky, I remembered the words of Andy's therapist during one of the joint sessions we had attended. Sometimes we need to break completely to rebuild ourselves stronger. The journey had not been easy. There had been days of doubt, moments of fear, periods of anger that seemed insurmountable. But standing on the other side of that year of transformation, I could see clearly what had been impossible to discern in the immediate aftermath of the broken glass: that sometimes what appears to be destruction is actually the first step toward a more authentic reconstruction. Andy had not just survived. He had emerged as someone more confident, more purposeful, more aligned with his true values than he had been before. He had taken the fragments of his broken trust and fashioned them into a foundation for helping others, turning his personal tragedy into a force for positive change in ways neither of us could have imagined that night in the dining room. The broken glass had long since been swept away, but its impact remained transformed from weapon to watershed, from ending to beginning. In its absence, we had found a truth more valuable than any crystal: that even the most painful shattering can lead to reconstruction, to renewal, to a life rebuilt not just as it was before, but with greater purpose, deeper understanding, and the kind of strength that comes only from having been broken, and finding within yourself the courage to begin again.